Each week, we have an in-depth conversation with one of the key players in the legislative process. This week, we welcome Representative Kent McCarty, a Republican from Hattiesburg who represents District 101. He was first elected in 2019 and is now serving his second term. Representative McCarty is the vice chairman of the House Education Committee. Welcome to At Issue, Representative McCarty.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
All right. So, vice chair of the Education Committee and chief architect of the Inspire Act. And that's kind of where we'd like to start. A lot of questions about education funding over the last few years. Some, moves being made as far as teacher pay raise a few years ago and other things. So I'm going to start off here. Why Inspire? Why is the House taking the approach of a new formula instead of looking at MAEP, the Mississippi Adequate Education Program, which has been around for decades, and funding that? Why this new program?
That's a great place to start with all of this. I think, for us, when I looked at what I saw were the problems with MAEP, which was that, we talk about it as though it is very equitable, and that we treat that as gospel. And then looking into under the hood where the money's actually going, I realized that that's actually really not the case. So rather than keep making tweaks around the margins, we wanted to basically look at it from the ground up and say, what can we do to make sure that the most resources we can get are going to the districts that need it the most? And, that's kind of how we got to Inspire. And we looked at, what a lot of different states are doing as far as student funding. And, this weighted student funding is not a new thing at all, but it is something that a state like Mississippi that has such a diverse in so many ways. Our population is diverse from community to community in so many different ways, across all demographics. No community looks like another. Going to a model that's weighted student funding that actually looks at the needs of that student in order to set their funding level is uniquely beneficial to a state like Mississippi. So that's why we went the direction we went.
Well, I mean, when you describe that, it sounds kind of like a subjective way of looking at needs in education, and that is some of the criticism that this program or this funding formula or funding mechanism gets from naysayers, which is it lacks an objective formula. Why kick aside the objective formula? It's a cornerstone of MAEP. A lot of public education proponents want an objective formula, but because there's a fairness in it. What's your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, I understand the appeal, especially on paper, of something like an objective formula. And again, I say that as somebody who's not opposed to looking at that. But the issue is with anything like that, we fund government the way that we fund government. I mean, we set the appropriation in the legislature, and that's not a perfect process, and I'm not saying that it's the right way to do it, but that is the reality of every state legislature in the country. We fund what we fund. So for us to have an objective formula on the front end is fine, but if we're not going to follow it, which we've only done, we all know the numbers. We've only done that twice since MAP was passed. And again, I'm not saying that's a good thing, but that's the reality. So what I wanted to do and what we in the House wanted to do and what the Speaker has set out in his first speech as Speaker when he was elected Speaker of the House was that he wanted to address the inequities in the formula. And that objective front end number, whatever it is, doesn't do anything to address the inequity. That's just a starting point. So we basically said, okay, we're going to look at what we're doing now, which is what we did. We looked at the funding level we're set now. Our base student cost that we set in year one is a little bit higher when you look at the actual per student enrolled number, because this is an enrollment-based formula, whereas MAP is an attendance-based distribution. We looked at the number we're spending per student. We set that number higher than that, and then we added these weights on top of it to target those students that require more resources. And that whatever those weights look like serve different purposes, but that is the way that we achieve the equity that we wanted to fix with the formula. So basically, so that whatever amount we appropriated, this was our mission, whatever amount we appropriate, we want to make sure that that money is spent in the most effective way possible for the students who need it the most. And that's what Inspire does. Why
look at enrollment over average daily attendance? Because attendance, I believe it looks, those enrollment numbers come from I think the average attendance between August and September. I believe, or does it continue through October?
So there's 2 months.
But why? But I mean, but you can clear that up. But also, but why the change there? I mean, to some it might sound like it's not that big of a deal, but when you talk about enrollment versus attendance, it can kind of compound into something more meaningful.
Sure, it's a huge deal for school districts. I mean, this has been one of the biggest requests we've gotten from superintendents since I've been in the legislature, was to switch MAEP to an enrollment-based formula, which we passed out of the House several times. It's been a priority of the House since I've been here, at least. I've authored a bill, I think, every year, except for this one. Well, I had it this year too, actually, but we were obviously pushing Inspire. But I've had a bill every year to switch MAEP to ADM, which is average daily membership. And we passed it out of the House a few times. But one of the main things that superintendents and school districts ask for it is because of the predictability in the funding. Everybody knows that, especially these days, people get sick. There's all kind of, I feel like everybody I know has been sick for the last 3 months. Obviously, it's even worse in the fall. So teachers and administrators and school districts are fighting so hard to get butts in seats during those the months where they do the counts, because that's what their next year enrollment is going to be set at. Obviously, because a child's out with the flu doesn't lower the cost of the education of the school day. You don't dock a teacher's pay because she's only got 90% of her class present. All of those costs, the majority of those costs are fixed. So since they're fixed, we wanted to fund based on the decisions, or based on the variable that's going to be used to make those decisions, which is enrollment, not attendance.
Right.
So that's a big part of the bill that I think gets kind of lost because it is kind of in the weeds. But anybody that's ever done a school budget or worked in a district office or taught a class where pressure is on them to make sure their students come in for those. They want them there every day, but particularly when they're there to count for ADA, because that's how your funding is set. So to do away with that and to switch to enrollment is a huge win for every district in the state. And it also just makes sense because, again, most of the costs that go into running a school are fixed. They're not going to vary because a child was absent.
All right. So then the question about funding comes in. You brought in that, the MAEP and the lack of funding it received. It's a formula. The legislature is supposed to fund it according to the formula, but it hasn't. And I know you've gotten this question before. You got it on the House floor when you presented this bill. How can we be ensured that the legislature will fund if Inspire were to become law, and your approach is to be the way education is funded in Mississippi? How and what insurances can the legislature make that funding will be matched on a year-to-year basis?
Well, I think, for one thing, just from an optics perspective, and I hate to talk about things in terms of optics, but from an optics perspective, we've done the work to develop this new formula. Say we get it across the finish line. It will be a huge political issue for all of us to come back next year and say, well, we just passed this perfect formula that we love so much, but we can't afford it already in year 2. So I think that pressure exists on us right now anyway. And I think with a formula like Inspire, I really do believe this. I think people will see in time how much more payoff we get from that investment in education with a formula like Inspire, that's sending money to districts that really need it. And I want to go like a step deeper into that if I can.
Sure.
With MAEP, I know there's been a lot of criticism through the years that it's, too old and too confusing and all that. And I've said this multiple times, I don't subscribe to any of that. My issue with MAEP is that this same, we're putting $250 million new dollars in education. If we put that same $250 million in education, that's going to put more money into districts that already have the local tax base to pay for their students' education, to provide for those needs, and a lot less in the districts that need it the most. And I want to go even a step further and talk about JPS, because obviously, most of the listeners, I feel like most of our listeners here are probably going to be at least involved in something in Jackson. And I think this is the best example of how much better a job it does at providing equity. If you fully funded MAEP today for 2025, that would put, I think, about $2 million more into JPS over last year's school funding. If you fully fund Inspire right now for 2025, which we've passed a bill to do that, that would put $24 million into JPS's budget for 2025 and onward. So you're talking about a difference in $22 million. The difference in, a couple percentage points and almost 20% in this formula compared to MAEP. And there's no amount of funding you could throw into MAEP that's ever going to direct those kind of resources into a city like Jackson that does not have the property tax base to fund its education. You couldn't tax the citizens of Jackson at a high enough level to pay for schools in Jackson, to pay for education in Jackson without substantial state support. And they've missed out on that for the last 20, 30 years because of the way MAEP is structured. So because this looks at actual student need, and JPS is one of the highest need school districts in the state, because it looks at actual student need, they are one of the biggest winners in this bill. And I think that's, kind of been lost in all this, that there have been so many crazy things said about this bill and what this bill seeks to accomplish. And it's about none of those crazy things that you've heard.
And we're going to get to some of those in a second.
I can't wait to talk about that. But this bill is just about putting more money in the pockets of districts that needs it. It's not about punishing any district. There are no big losers in this bill. Most districts come out better. They come out even to much better. That's the range of outcomes. And there's a few outliers which we can talk about.
14, I think, or so.
There's 15 total, yeah. And there's a few outliers which we can talk about, a little bit later. But again, it's not about punishing any district just because a district's got a lot of local resources. We're not trying to take from them. We're just trying to make sure that every dollar we invest at this point is going to a district that really needs it, because those students are struggling in so many ways that our more wealthy districts just don't even understand.
So the per pupil, student spending kind of number that is objectively calculated in AEP, and you say that, the way it's calculated doesn't really account for need. What I mean, so Inspire has this kind of more a subjective approach, right? To see, okay, what districts need more, have more need, require more need. But what objective, I guess, mechanisms or data are you using to determine what that need is? I mean, is this completely subjective, or are there what is the hard data that's informing where there is need versus where there's more need versus where there's less need?
So the data that goes into, I think if this is what you're asking, the data that goes into which districts are
right. I mean, because I know there's also, there is a committee, as it were, of school experts that are going to inform or advise the legislature on what funding should be. But surely somewhere it has to be informed by some type of objective data, right?
Yeah, right. So the distribution is based on the actual hard demographic data from those districts. So if that's what you're asking, I think that's what you're asking.
Partially, but also but the need, like what's informing need? Like what's informing?
So one of the biggest measures of that in this bill, one of the biggest ways that we address that is through the poverty weights. So there's a 30% weight added for any student who is in poverty, and the metrics for that are fairly broad. But it uses what we used for to actually put this bill together was the identified student percentage, which the department collects that information and has that information. Anybody can download it off the website, off the NDU website. But that basically looks at any student that's already whose family or themselves are a part of any like federal poverty program. So whether they be in CHIPS, free and reduced lunch, there's a variety of different things, whether they're foster kids, migrant, runaway, anything like that. That number, that identified student percentage, aggregates all that information from those federal programs, and that's the number that we use to determine, which students would fall into the low income category. So we've got that percentage from MDE, and there's also a concentrated poverty weight that's added on top of that. So any district that has above a certain threshold, they get an extra 10% weight added on to their total allocation to help address those really persistent problems in our highest need communities.
All right. And then what about other needs? Whether it's special education needs, special services needs. How are those things calculated?
So there's three different tiers, and that's in accordance with the tier of your IEP. So when a student gets an IEP, there's three different tiers. For those that fall into tier 1, I believe it's a 60% weight. Tier 2 is 125% additional weight, and then tier 3, I believe, is 160. I may be off a few percentage points on those. It's early in the week. It's a Monday, so I gotta dust off the brain a little bit.
And then finally, you mentioned about what's said, what other things have been said about the bill. You have your plan. The Senate has their plan. Chairman DeBar, when he presented the Senate plan on the floor, he even made specific reference to the outside organizations that might have informed or influenced the creation of Inspire. Empower, the Mississippi Center for Public Policy, to name two. Now, those are two organizations. Those are two conservative think tanks that have strongly pushed school vouchers. So some detractors to Inspire say that this is could be a Trojan horse to open up, school choice or scholarship funding. So I guess I'll just give you an opportunity to respond to those concerns.
Yeah, thank you for that. So, I've said this on the floor, and I've said this multiple times since, and this is not a personal knock at any of these organizations. I'm sure they're probably run by some great people, but I have never worked with either of the two organizations you mentioned on this bill. I've never spoken to them about this bill. I understand that there are people that it's easier to just, they're the boogeyman. You can say empower and education. Everybody's like, oh, but again, I mean, I've said this again multiple times. I'll say it again. They were not for me in my election. They actively campaigned against me, spent money against me in my first election. I'm sure that they probably would do the same, would love to do the same again, at some point. So maybe not, maybe I've won them over, but this is a good bill that was not written by either of them. And it has nothing to do with vouchers. I'm glad you mentioned that specifically, because I want to be abundantly clear about that and say again that if at any point this becomes a voucher bill, I'm not going to support the bill anymore either. And that's after I've spent so much time on this bill that I can't even hardly see straight anymore. I don't support expanding public school vouchers for public money for private schools. I don't support any of that. I never have. And this bill isn't about that. And I will say to that point, a lot of people have tried to draw the line from one to another, but there's no there. There are states that have weighted student funding formulas like Texas that have been trying to pass vouchers but haven't been able to because the two discussions are totally separate. And then on the flip side of that, there are states like Ohio and West Virginia that have funding formulas that are very much like MAEP but have expansive voucher programs. The two are just not connected. And people like to point to Tennessee because apparently they've switched to weighted student funding recently and now they're trying to pass vouchers. But that's one example where maybe, they haven't passed them yet, so maybe it works out like that. But the conversation between the two is totally separate. And there's nothing about, we have vouchers now. They're scaled back and they're limited for special needs, but there's nothing about MAEP that protects you from vouchers. So that whole argument is just a total lie because it doesn't exist in reality. We could pass an expansive voucher program tomorrow with MAP intact, and we'd simply set the voucher at a price and we'd pass the bill. I wouldn't vote for it, and I hope we don't do that. But that could happen now. This has nothing to do with that.
And then just lastly, the Senate's plan is sitting with you. Your plan sitting with them. Something has to give this week as far as moving one of the two forward, if not both. But I mean, it just like a lot of education changes. This seems to be headed to conference. Where's the line? What concessions as you work this out with the Senate? Is there a red line? What are we looking at as if this ends up in conference?
Well, so just to briefly correct you a little bit. I hate to do that, but we sent their bill back with our language in it. So you have done a strike all with your language in it. Without our reverse repealer. They also have our budget. So the Senate could actually today take up, I doubt they will. I wish they would, but they could take up the Inspire bill in a Senate bill. I think it's 2332. They could take that up today. They could take up the budget today. It's fully funded at $3.001 billion, which is more than full funding of MAEP for 2025, just for everybody that's keeping score at home. So we're talking about more money that's spent more efficiently than even full funding of MAEP, and yet still somehow this is supposed to be bad for education. I don't understand. That math doesn't math to me. I think most people that have said that don't have the right information as far as the actual numbers, or they're just being dishonest. So, but they have all the vehicles at their disposal. There's no reverse repealer in the budget. There's no reverse repealer in the funding bill, the enacting language. So they could pass both of those and have those to the governor by the end of the week. And we'd be done.
If they have a budget bill, but the Inspire Act depends on this calculation made by a panel or a committee of experts, how is that? How do you have a budget when that panel hasn't been formed yet?
For the first year of the bill, the first year is set in statute. And this is another thing I'm glad you mentioned. I could kind of back up a little bit and provide some more clarity on this. The bill, as it has been passed right now through the House, has a statutory minimum for school funding. It says $6,650 per student is the minimum, shall be the minimum.
That shall's important.
Shall's a good word. It doesn't always mean shall, but it's a good word. Yeah. It's the strongest word we got. We always I joke with our drafting attorneys, like, I wish we had like super shall. So like people knew like it's shall, but it really means shall this time. Like, strong shall. So it says shall be a minimum of $6,650. And that's for 2025. So after that, there's also a 3-year period of time where no school can receive less money. It scales down so that they can, for schools that will get less money, it kind of eases them into that over a 3-year period. After that 3-year period, there's a yearly inflation component. So that's another thing that's been, the early draft of the bill did not have an inflation adjustment. We added that in before we took it out in committee. We did an amendment in committee to add that into the bill, which I think a lot of people are working off old information, but that is a part of it.
So, the original. So to clarify, the original bill that passed, the House bill that passed, did not include this inflation.
It did. No,
it did.
It never was voted on without that. The original draft, as it was uploaded to the computer, did not have an inflation component. But we met with a lot of superintendents, talked with public education advocates, and ended up in committee with the House bill, the first vote on it in the House bill. We added that inflation component with the strike all, and we changed a couple other things. We added the inflation component, and we also added the panel of superintendents and Department of Education officials that will be responsible for giving us a recommendation every 4 years after beginning in year 4. Okay. So that panel, where the original question, and I just went down like the longest.
There's a lot going on.
The longest rabbit hole I could possibly just jump down. But back to the question, that doesn't actually begin until year 4. So the first number is set at 6650 in statute, shall be this number. And then the inflation begins in year 3, and that's an annual compounding inflation. It's not based on a 20-year average. It's based on the previous year's inflation applied to 20% of that cost, because that's about what we estimate is subject to inflation.
All right. And so are there any other differences between the original House bill and what you sent back to the Senate?
No, there were a few like technical things. It's like a couple of definitions we kind of tightened up. It didn't change anything in the bill substantially, but we made those in the Senate bill. So actually, the version of Inspire in the Senate bill is the better, quote, better of the two, because we fixed those little things. Most of them were just like, there were a couple typographical. One of the definitions, we got a little bit, the words were transposed, so we had to flip those around. But they've got the best version of the bill. So, at this point, to your point earlier, we're waiting on would love to see them pass both of these bills out. Assuming that doesn't happen, invite conference on the Senate bill, and we can start doing that now, or send something back to us in the House bill, and we'll have 2 options to consider. Whatever the route is, right now we're just waiting on the Senate. And today's Monday, so the 1st. So by the time, I don't know when this will come out, but these things may have already worked themselves out by then.
And assuming this does go to conference, is the House position Inspire or nothing?
I wouldn't say that it's Inspire. Okay. I would never go as far as to say anything in the legislature is this or nothing.
Right.
But I do think we had a strong vote in favor of this, and to have 95 members of the House, bipartisan support. We only had 13 no votes on the original vote. To have bipartisan support for something like this, I think it sends a message. And I think there's just a lot that we get right in this bill. And I think people, the more they see, okay, we're going to put $250 million into education. Do we want that money to go to school districts that already have millions and millions of dollars of economic development money that's coming their way in the next few years on an annual basis? Or do we want to try to put that into school districts that can't afford like textbooks and where kids can like see the sky through the gym ceiling? Like those are the districts, those are the kids that we should be worried about. Because by and large, are the kids that don't have the supports at home, and school is where that's their hope. That is what we need to provide for them to get them to where we want them to be, and to get them where they can live, happy, productive lives. And it all starts in the schoolhouse. And it's just, again, so insane to me that I can't stress enough how pure the mission is here of Inspire, just to try to provide some resources to districts that need it the most. And there are half of the school districts in the state will receive more money under Inspire than they would under full funding of MAEP. The Senate Plan 0 will receive more money because theirs is just a reduced MAEP, and that's all their bill really does, is lower the threshold for full funding through some tweaks on the front end. So this bill really is we're just trying to push these resources to the communities that need it the most and the students that need it the most, because that's, I think, what our mission should be. In a state with such disparity between communities that have and communities that don't, we should try to do everything we can to fix that.
All right, a lot of time on Inspire. It's not the only piece of legislation that you've either authored or supported in education. You've also, and again, you mentioned this is Monday. This might change, but we can still talk. I think overall big idea here, and I think you've said that there's agreement in the Senate on this, and that is a bill that would kind of abolish the Mississippi Achievement School District and revise some of the processes about a district being placed into as a district of transformation. Why abolish the Achievement School District? obviously you have an assessment of how that's gone that makes you want to abolish it, and why there might be a legislative appetite overall to abolish it. So I'll give you a moment to explain this legislation.
Yeah, so that actually, we've worked with the department on this legislation. They actually came to us, and I think everybody agrees that the way that this is set up now is not the best way to do it. And the districts that are, that we're talking about they just want, like, they need a way out. They need a path out. And right now there's not really one. So what we wanted to make sure we did is provide them the ability to get there, and also set them up where they're set up for success as they move out of this, the program that they're in now. So that was most of, our work with that on the Senate, and the little bit of differences between the two bills is just making sure that we are providing a sensible off-ramp as these districts move into, I guess, a more regular system of management. This was the route to do that. So.
What was the identified as things that weren't working with this approach?
Districts, we talk about this a lot, but districts need the ability to govern themselves. Having the department come in and take something over, take a district over, can work for a time, while the department's there. But typically, when a takeover from the outside happens, as soon as those takeover forces recede, what happens in the end? So we really got to look at setting districts up to, if they need the additional support from the department, let's do that. But let's do it in a way where they're still, governing themselves and still moving towards more independence, if that makes sense.
It's more of an intervention model rather than a takeover model?
That's probably a much better way to put that than I did. So.
Okay, I'm just...
No, I like that. I'm going to take that. I'm going to use that. Okay. I'm going to use that.
Sure. And then another big thing is the teacher residency program. It's an appropriation bill. But why is that? Why is that important? You're asking for funding, full funding of that. Why is this program important?
Yeah, I think, if we look at the districts that have the highest need for teachers, the teacher shortage in Mississippi there's pretty much no district that isn't affected by that. But the districts who really have the highest need are also those that are in areas where people probably are not looking to move. So what we're trying to do with this, and it's been a very successful program, my understanding of it, just in my conversations about it this session, is that it's a very successful program, and is, could obviously be utilized a lot more than we've allowed it to be. So providing some incentive and some assistance for teachers that are moving to these districts, that are willing to work in these critical shortage areas, I think is the key to getting them to do that. Because typically what you also see, and again, this is kind of back to some of the issues with MAP, the way that we fund or the way that we pay teacher salaries, there's a state salary scale, but then districts are also able to pay a supplement on top of that. So these districts that have all these local resources that the districts in a lot of regions of the state do not have, they're able to pay these high $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 supplements. So obviously, teachers that are mobile are going to move to those areas. Yeah. So what we've tried to do with this is try to provide a kind of a bridge. And then also, because everything is about Inspire these days, with that bill, we're trying to provide more resources to those schools that I'm talking about that can attract teachers. So then maybe they can have the resources to provide some additional supplements for those teachers as well. Okay.
And then mention programs that have done well. The early learning collaboratives, I think by most account from advocacy groups across the spectrum have been a success. You submitted some legislation that would expand it to every school district by 28, 29. That bill did not go anywhere. But again, why did this desire? What's informing this? Because it is limited right now, the early learning collaboratives. What's informing this decision to try to broaden it out and make it more universal?
So we've seen incredible success with our collaborative program in Mississippi. We've been kind of that sounds dramatic to say this, but genuinely kind of the talk of the country as far as states that have handled this correctly, expanding public pre-K. Because it's one thing to offer public pre-K, it's another entirely to offer high-quality public pre-K. And because the way we've rolled ours out, and I wasn't here when this was passed, obviously, but I've been a huge supporter of it in my time in the legislature, because we took a more measured approach that's kind of scaled it as we were able to handle the extra volume. We've made sure that most of our collaboratives are performing at extremely high levels, and the schools that have collaboratives or have students that can go to have a collaborative in their district have seen huge gains in early childhood, those kindergarten readiness scores, all the assessments that we give our students. There's so much science that shows that pre-K gives you such an edge. To be in school at 4, now even earlier than that, but to be in school at 4 when your brain is still developing, just gives you such an edge as you move through your education, to have that foundation. So, those have been one of the things that have moved the needle the most in Mississippi in education in the last 10 years or so. They kind of are a little bit under the radar, but, as we've seen what works and what doesn't, I would like to see us continue to expand that. Now, there are some communities, because of the way the collaborative program is set up, it's harder for some communities to find that local partner, the local resources to make that collaborative. So I think that there's different things we've looked at to try to assist with that as well. But again, I think this program has been so successful, and I think it's only, my goal, I think I could retire from the legislature happy if we pass Inspire, and if we get at least an option to have every child in the state in public pre-K. I'm not saying they have to go. That's one thing people are very clear about. It's not mandatory, but to at least allow
availability
the opportunity
and accessibility.
Right, at least have the opportunity for every child in the state to attend a free public pre-K. I think would be a huge, huge win for Mississippi.
All right. We came in here with a focus on education, but I mean, that's obviously you're a member of the House. You vote on many things, ask questions about many things, support many things. So outside of education, as we continue the session, as the latest deadlines approach, what is something that you're making a high priority, something outside of education?
Oh gosh. I mean, this session, and this is not a cop-out answer, but this is the truth. This session has been so heavily spent on Inspire. I mean, I've been, since the moment we got here and we got our assignments, committee assignments for this term very early, which I was very thankful to the speaker for prioritizing that so we could get started on this. But, I spent most of last year looking at something like Inspire, trying to figure out my thoughts around what I want to do with student funding, and without really knowing what this term would look like as far as where I'd be placed and, what chairmanship I'd have. So this session has really been, it's honestly just been about that. Okay. For me, I mean, there's obviously a lot of other big stuff going on. I know Medicaid expansion has been a huge thing. We passed that out of the House, and I did obviously support that. So I was happy to see us, make some progress on that issue. I think there's, Chairman McGee's done a great job working on that in the House. She's my neighbor district and also a good friend. So I've been very excited to watch what she's done with that legislation. I know there's a long way to go in that process too, but I was happy to see us move that. Yeah,
and the House plan a more traditional expansion that had a veto-proof majority. We'll see what the Senate does and where that goes. But right. Kim McCarty, thank you so much for joining us on At Issue. For an extended version of this interview with Representative Kim McCarty, please subscribe to our At Issue podcast. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.